Good morning,
In
ma'am.
2 minutes, yes, in 2 minutes we will start the session. As soon as Didi join, I think has Didi joined? Didi will join, okay.
Not yet, ma'am. Within 2 minutes, she'll be joining.
As soon as Didi joins, we will start.
Manju ma'am, Alka ma'am has just joined. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning, Rashna. Good morning.
Good morning, Didi.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Didi.
Yes, good morning.
With your permission,
Good morning.
I'd like to start.
Good morning, entire department and all the participants who are here. Yeah, you can start.
Thank you, Didi. Always do good whenever it is possible and wherever it is possible. This is what we have learned from Alka ma'am, Professor Alka Singh, today's resource person on 6th day of 7th day international, 7th international online contemporary theories, challenges and possibilities. So I'm extremely privileged to welcome our head of the family, our own, uh, very own Professor Alka Singh on the sixth day as resource person. Ma'am is the initiator and patron of this event. Um, and man has been into this world for more than 3 decades, several books, several papers, and awards, recognition. But moreover, ma'am is known for her continuous devotion to work which does good to all. This is what I have seen uh, since I'm connected. So, with these words, I would like to request our person, Professor Alka Singh, to continue with her talk, to start her talk. Thank you so much, ma'am. I think Didi is disconnected, Rashna.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am will be connecting again. There's some network issue on her side.
No problem, no problem. We will wait.
We can wait for a minute. Ma'am has joined.
Yes, yes, ma'am has joined.
Sorry, there was total network failure in the college.
Oh,
I don't know.
okay, Didi.
Huh.
Didi may, yes.
I think
So, Didi, yes, Didi,
now
you
you
can
can
start,
hear me
Didi.
and it's, huh? I can start?
Yes, Didi, please,
I'm
Didi.
sorry I missed out on your conversation, Manjari, but there was a total failure of network in the premises. Okay, so just
Didi,
just 1 minute. इसमें देखिए नेटवर्क बिल्कुल नहीं है, जीरो जरा सा क्यों हो गया है? Now I can start. I have connected myself to another network, hoping that it will be restored. So, good morning, one and all. The very beginning of the note was devastating in the failure of these technical glitches which we face every day. But I hope goodness prevails this talk today while we are here and comfortably I can complete the session. So thank you so much, Department of English, for having given me this privilege and space for sharing my thoughts with you, and also to all the participants. I would like to express my gratitude for having joined this faculty development program organized by the Department of English. And I'm sure that we shall all go back with a lot of speculations, a lot of debates which are there in our mind and which we need to carry forward, because climate change and the present contemporary theories play a very vital role in our existence today. I have been asked to speak on climate change. Just an introduction. Now, climate change is something which uh, has been in existence for quite some time, but the concept of a dialogue, debate, or a theory which is profound is still into being. We are still struggling with ways as students of literature and mechanisms in order to be able to interpret and understand this concept of climate change, how it comes about in the form of theory, and then further how it goes about affecting the social scenario and the communities at large. I'll try and make a brief presentation as to what I have tried to understand of climate change. Obviously, since we are talking about theories, much of it is actually taken up by all the writers who have been working on it and researching on it. We are just making a humble beginning. So just let's try to understand and interpret this concept as students of literature today. I am going to learn as much as you are probably going to pick up in this conference of this 1 week which we have spent together. I'll start now. The primary aim of this week-long faculty development program was to speculate on few contemporary theoretical conjunctures that demands a thinking, rethinking, and a critical perspective on the various thematic concerns taken up. Climate change in the present time occupies a pivotal role in political, scientific, and cultural imagination. Social theorists have been exploring the various issues on environment, but probably confined to limited theoretical and conceptual difficulties. Elizabeth Shaw, who is basically a professor of sociology and has also been granted an ESRC Climate Change Leadership Fellow, she has a very pertinent questions to all the people involved with social theory as to who are they talking and what are they addressing, what are they talking about. So basically, to begin with, as I just said, that they still need to explore further because they need to move beyond this, and we as students of literature need to delve into problems of climate change, focusing not only on social theory in isolation, but also on nature, culture, and the conceptual innovation across the social sciences. Now, this has been explicitly captured in the text by Howard Newby, which talks about One World, Two Cultures, Sociology and the Environment, written in 1997. Now, this was to primarily deal with the theory that is in existence and how we need to go a little beyond that theory which exists for us. The second aspect of my conversation today will be with you would be the vulnerability and adaptation of mankind to the contemporary times, which leads to a quest of a robust policy relevant framework of the capacity of individuals and social groups to cope up with it, recover or adapt to the external stress placed on their livelihoods and well-being. And this is extremely important to us being students of literature. Now, this effort primarily places the social and economic well-being of a society at the center of the analysis, focusing on socio-economic and institutional constraints. So these are two aspects. And the third aspect which we'll talk about is that the theory on climate change does not stand in isolation, but is coupled with a number of other concepts which make it into a wider scope for study and understanding of the perilous condition in which the planet has been placed. To begin with, the social theoretical considerations of climate change deal with three aspects I've taken up: construction and definition of societal problems, showing how climate change is configured as a topic of scientific, popular, and policy concern, and in exposing the moral, ethical, and political implications of the processes which it describes at different level. In a very important research paper which talks about theory, culture, and society in 2010, various researchers have contributed. For instance, Cooper, he concentrates on methodologies, while you'll find McCreight and Dunlap, they are talking about social movement. This other writer, which talks about how climate change is actually read and written. Through these works, we can assimilate that knowledge of climate change, the policy responses, and the public representations are conceptual in nature. And prior to this, the same can be seen in Social Theory and Global Environment by Radcliffe and Benton in 1994. The second aspect, first was the theoretical concept of this from social theory point of view. Second is the relation between nature and culture, as Shackley and Wine in 1995 in Science and Public Policy, which states reinstating of humans as part and not outside nature. That means the human beings need to be a very integral part of this entire investigation that we are making. Second is defying the nature and the culture divide. I mean, basically, there has been a kind of a division between nature and culture as in existence with the theories that are existing. So we need to defy that divide and bring about emphasis on the importance of human and animal relationship within social theory. Now, Heard, she has a very important point to make in this paper on theory, society, and culture, where she refers to human beings and saying that it is an intriguing account of people as a soup of microbes. Now, that was a statement which I think can trigger off a whole range of emotions in our concept of understanding of how the humans, being the animals, culture, and nature, how integral they are to each other in the understanding of what is happening without. The third assumption which comes up is climate change creates new sites of tension and contradiction within the contemporary capitalism. So next is capitalism. According to Ray in 2010 and Hume, it is a discursive medium, and for Cooper, it is embedded in global financial market. I think this concept we are very clear about, that how the global market and how capitalism intrudes into it and brings about what today we are facing as a problem, and later on it is going to be more dangerous in its own form. Now, the Elizabeth Shaw has done a very sound research paper where in the first part, which I was just talking to you about, she has talked about social theory and climate change. So we've been just referring to social theory and climate change. But what she says is it is more important also that we need to understand climate change and social theory. That is, it's vice versa. That is, both are actually directly proportional to each other. You cannot undermine either of it. Now, through these discussions which I have been putting to you, it questions the politics of discourse in social theory and what it has to say in relation to climate change, and further moves forward to analyze how climate change has affected theoretical definitions across social sciences, and further explore those concepts that pose a challenge to the established school of thought. We are all moving in a direction where we keep ourselves confined to a conceptualized school of thought. Climate change requires a moving out. As we talked about, it is not only about within, but it is also about without, and both are in a way in a very close relationship with each other, with the affiliation to be able to interpret one without the other is not just possible. Having recognized that climate change in total, which Ure says in his words, I quote, total reorganization of social life, nothing more and nothing less, unquote, has ignited the influential theories of transition, which I just talked about to you, that it does not stand in isolation, but it is coupled with other theories. For instance, we begin with transition and then go on to talk about consumerism, production, which will all ultimately lead to the concept and theory of climate change. So the theory of transition, and we understand that this will not stand in isolation, but is also, now transition itself is also coupled with innovation studies, science and technology, evolutionary economics, history and science. So all these aspects taken in totality refer to what we can talk today in terms of transitional theory. In totality, it holds social arrangements together, and also what is it that makes it fall apart. According to Elzin, the societal transformations, I quote, not only involve new technological artifacts, but also new markets, user practice, regulations, infrastructure, and cultural meanings. While Burkout, understanding social change is in essence a process of characterizing and analyzing the emergent qualities and characteristics of different types of socio-technical configuration. Thirdly, system of provision of food, water, or energy are assumed to contribute more than the context in which consumer choices are made. If we look at all these, it points out that transitions towards sustainability depends on societal innovation. If there are reasons to be cautious, there are also reasons to celebrate the intellectual space that the transition management literature has created, and to exploit the room it makes for thinking seriously about how environmentally problematic ways of life are reproduced and how they change according to Kem and Lurberg in 2006. Similarly, historical analysis of societal transformation, infrastructural transformation provide potentially relevant insights for the future, while innovation studies concentrates on how new social and technical arrangements come into being and not on how they disappear. So what we are more interested is what is it that makes it come into being rather than looking at the aspect as to, because these, as we have talked about, they are in transition. They seem to fall out as soon as the next one comes in. So we need to understand as to how they actually come into being, despite the fact that these debates may not be classically environmental, but yet subtly moves towards lower carbon ways of life. And that is, I think, what is of interest to all of us when we are trying to understand climate change. Another stream of intellectual inquiry is the sociology of consumption. Moving from transition to innovation, next we come to is basically the sociology of consumption, wherein Beck describes the environmental consequence as, I quote, an insatiable appetite for natural resources. And further, Ward in 2005 refers to acquisition as merely a part of the ordinary accomplishment of everyday life. I think this takes us back, way back, to literature written by Francis Bacon in the 16th century, where the Renaissance had put the spirit of, where he talks about the different aspects of snobbery, and where acquisition was one of them, to be able to acquire things without actually realizing, is this a basic need of survival on this earth? And how far is it for the betterment, or is it going to harm the environment in which we are existing? So both of them speculate and make us understand it is mankind with this insatiable desire of acquiring things and acquiring things for ordinary accomplishments of everyday life. And naturally, this points out to, interestingly, to a very important social practice which comes into being, persists for some time, and then disappears. You get into one gadget. You see how very comfortable we as mankind, we as intellectual human beings, we claim. The minute a thing is in the market, there is a very strong desire to be the proud possessor. And it hardly takes any time before you realize that that becomes redundant to be replaced by another gadget that comes into the market. We are very, very conservative when we want to talk about and make changes in concepts of culture. Very stringent, our culture does not permit this. But we are not ready to review the other changes which we imbibe so very naturally, as though it has been in existence from times immemorial, and then there is no resistance from anyone. But certain concepts of culture and contemporary times that needs to be revisited, looked at in maybe a very contemporary manner, is loaded with conjunctures of, with question marks as to why this is being brought about. So therefore, the social practices which disappear and the challenge responding and adapting to climate change goes beyond the study of green consumerism or the relation between environmental belief and action, and demands and understanding of the changing patterns of mobility, food consumption, heating, cooling, or washing. This calls for a tracking of the relationship between consumption and production. So moving on from the social theorists and going to transition, adaptation, consumerism, And now we come to the relationship between consumption and production. A very simple example in all our homes, I think all of us sitting here can identify, is the use of the air conditioners in the houses. It has automatically become an essential need of our contemporary lifestyle, where probably it was unthought of. And this was all due to the production in the market, which we refer to as, of course, the financial market, the globalization. The vehicles on the roadside, all which are responsible for climate change. If you look at an example, earlier there used to be so many children in one family, and then they were manageable, where it's not that they were not educated. They all went to school. They all had means of going to the school, walking down. But today, despite the fact that we have maybe one or two children in the family, and the time constraint, which is the biggest problem before us, so we need vehicles, more than one vehicle in a family. As a matter of fact, every individual needs a vehicle to be able to commute. And for the time constraint, the children needs to be driven down to the school through their private vehicles. All this is basically ignited into the minds of the common man through the production which is there in the market, and of course how the financial market affects the psyche of a mankind. We even in construction, when we look at our houses, there used to be maybe 2 rooms, 3 rooms in a house, and all of us were surviving in it. But today, each one needs a space of their own, a washroom or a bathroom of their own. Otherwise, either you get late to office or the children get late to school. So the need-based production has ignited, and that is how it is related to both consumption and production. The many tracks that spin out from these approaches point out to the fact that the conceptual development is inspired by the practical challenges of climate change and within the framework of social theory. Therefore, social theory and the relation between social change and climate change out here do converge in some ways to inquire into sustainable consumption, and ought to build audiences, not only that which comes from within, but that which is evolving outside. Moving forward, we go on to assessing vulnerability of human individuals and communities to environmental stress, specifically climate variability and change in the context of global warming. Is important to define the magnitude of the threat imposed on the planet. This initiates an analysis of remedial action, creating strategies and facilitating adaptation. So this is what I just said, that vulnerability and adaptation both need to go hand in hand. So we are already looking at the problems that are existing before us, and what we need to look at is now remedial action as to how we can sustain and build up strategies which will help us adapt ourselves to the existing times. Somehow, vulnerability and policy relevance of adaptation need far more attention for human well-being than what has been given up till now. And thereafter, an analysis of the factors that influence vulnerability, like social, economic, and institutional factors within a community, and promote or constrain options for adaptation. So the most important and sustainable form of intervention would probably be to find out and carefully reinforce that which limits or enhances vulnerability, and obviously to empower those that are likely to be affected by climate stress. Let us move forward to explore climate change now in literature. as students of literature, a fact that each one of us are fully aware of the climate change, but yet it is latent to the point that the planet Earth is in trouble. I think it needs to be highlighted into our very psyche to understand that the planet Earth is in trouble. So, despite the denial, a new genre of literature has come into being, perhaps as a ray of hope. 2019, somewhere in Hindustan Times, I remember reading, there was an article which talks about climate change and the problems and the literature that is written on it, where a statement was made. Now, this statement was not new because Robert Macfarlane had made it in way back in 2005, where he questions where is the climate fiction. And the same seems to be echoed by Amitav Ghosh in this paper in 2019. And Amitav Ghosh himself, having written a climate related non-fiction, he had talked about dearrangement. And but he goes on to acknowledge that the lack of rich storytelling, narrative, and memorable characters didn't find readers, and it failed to capture the public imagination. And this is what was happening to all the other writers that were writing on the problems of climate or the climate change in somewhere in 2000 and beyond that. The climate crisis is terrifying for all of us, and it is difficult to get the local crisis. So, despite the concerns or the headlines, it would not create the impact. The realization of the approaching apocalypse, risk of losing homes, community identities, histories, and our humanity, leading to internal anguish with environmental collapse, gave way to writings in various genres focusing on the personal and emotional toll of the changing world. The literature, not that I'm going to get into the depth of the books or the literature, because I'm sure you're all fully aware of the texts, some of them at least, which were written during this time, but we can we can mention a few. For instance, a Nobel laureate, Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Then we have Lucy Elliman Duck's Newburyport. It was shortlisted for the Book Award in 2019. And goes on to unravel life, and also at the same time, it looks at America losing its hold on the natural world. Then there is Richard Parr's, which was Pulitzer Prize winning 2019, The Overstory, which is, the whole thing is structured like a tree. And it connects 9 Americans and their relationship with the forests. So it's a kind of an imaginative interpretation that we see there. And Maja Lunde's The History of Bees. Now this talks about, imagines a China of 2098. And it talks about bees being extinct. And naturally, then the human beings have to apply pollens with their hands to the fruits, trees, so that they could get food. Otherwise, they would be deprived of food in totality. It's a very grim picture of the future as we look at it. Then there is this novel called Boca Rotan, which talks about reflections of bringing a girl child into a world that seems to be falling apart. And there are so many others, I think, which we need to look at to be able to understand what these writers were trying to say. While looking at the fictional representations, we need to explore how the complexity of climate change as both scientific and cultural phenomena demands a corresponding degree of complexity in the writings as well, which require a shift demanding environmental criticism, eco-criticism, to move from concepts of nature and place to embrace a new understanding of the local in relation to the global. Climate change asks the literary writers, now the term literary in itself is a very troublesome term, to re-evaluate themselves, to move beyond their comfort zones. At present, other forms of prose such as travel writing, nature writing, and life writing is already being addressed. Climate change representation possess a prehistory of portrayal. You know, this takes us to the ancient times because you look at George's Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood in the Old Testament, which has talked about the doomsday in the New Testament. So it's not that it does not have a history that dates back to the ancient times. But beyond this, if we go back, it is too vast a literature. But moving into the contemporary times, the other world which we need to explore here is the science fiction. You know, new terminology for such texts have come into being. Science fiction, you know, it's known as the sci-fi, I think, and then it is the climate fiction would be cli-fi. These are terminologies which are being used. And this other world in science fiction, there is a terminology given for it by Subin, and he calls it novums, Novums, novums. And this is created due to extreme environmental change. I mean, it is represented when I'm talking about science fiction due to the extreme environmental change which we are witnessing now. A term has been created to be able to understand the fiction. And this also refers to extraterrestrial or futuristic fiction. Now, extraterrestrial would mean what? It is another term which has been used for this is terraforming. And this, what is terraforming exactly? It is making planets habitable by changing their climate. And this was introduced in short stories by Jack Williamson in 1942. So where the planets were made habitable by changing their climate, how are they going to survive? We find many writers which followed suit, but when we are talking of science fiction, the mention of Robinson's Mars trilogy is outstanding. It won several awards, and it has it's 3 books in continuation, and it has given a vivid description of this problem of the climate change. Last 3 decades of the 20th century, beginning from 1970, saw the science fiction on biochemical pollution, acid rain, ozone depletion, greenhouse effect, that future history is presented as utopias or dystopias for in novels like Ecopotia, and then you have the last, I think, what does it say? The Last Gasp, I think. And also novels such as Heat and The Sea in the Summer, which refer to ecological future histories depicting climate change Earth. There are also thriller novels which were very much appreciated, like State of Fear and The Doomsday Report. But all these novels, they take care of the environmental problems at different levels. Strangely, surprisingly, we find also humor in the realm of political satire in a very outstanding work of Stark, The Other Eden, given by Ben Elton. So The Stark and the Other Eden by Ben Elton. Not to miss out the serious literary writers. I refrain from using the term, but sometimes we need to, and you will find Paul Therox's work, which talks about, the name of the book is Ozone, but O is separated from zone, and it talks about this problem of environment. Eco-criticism. Next, I come to eco-criticism, and is the study of relationship between literature and the physical environment. And therefore, all aforesaid genres of writing are subsumed in it, but they require a specific grouping of literary writers according to a set of attitudes towards the physical environment. You know, we have whole, as I just now discussed, there are different genres which we discussed, but then we require a specific grouping. Why we need that is because we need to concentrate on the physical environment on which we are talking today. For example, if you look at a single text or a single author interpretation, in this I would like to mention Margaret Atwood. It's like a science fiction, but it comes out a good volume on Earths and the Crake, and it does not only refer to climate change, but it also talks about rampant genetic modification leading to species extinction and deadly virus epidemics. McCarthy's The Road is also the journey of an unnamed father and son to escape the deadly impact of climate change. And then we come to this statement of Mongoy, which says, I quote, "What would happen if the world lost its biosphere, only human hunting for food among dead wood and soot?" Which is so very grim and gruesome. If we try to get into each word, it is very destabilizing. It affects the psyche in a way where I think we all need to sit and think about. So eco-criticism thus investigates literature, culture, and environment, advocates interdisciplinary studies, ideas of nature and literature. It also deconstructs ideological assumptions that underpin modern Western lifestyle. But eco-criticism, if it is a spiritual and importance of the natural world, the critical theory revolves around culture and language. But despite the differences, both find common ground in a growing intellectual curiosity, given the fact that the historical animosity between the two movements does exist. Beyond eco-criticism, we come to eco-historicism, which develop a subtler historical understanding of literature and the science of climate. Here, eco-historicists working together will bring about a holistic understanding of science, past and present. While this whole bunch of literature that I have brought before you, naming just a few, is the result of the extensive work done by Aaron Trexler and Adeline Jones. And it gives way to methodological practices of literary criticism, eco-criticism, critical theory, and historicism. This in totality may lead to a new literary and critical climate and strategies to prepare for the times to come and how it will be addressed. Eco-critics have engaged more with purity and the discourse surrounding its virgin, within quotes, its virgin wilderness and the preservation of uncorrupted last green places. So, understanding low levels of awareness about the seriousness of climate change, coupled with the aggressive selling of the growth dream, high aspiration levels, high consumption lifestyles of a significant section of the population seems to have militated against the creation and consumption of the climate fiction in a country like India. But all this is with the worsening climate situation, eco-fiction and criticism develop a sense of planet alongside a sense of place. And they both meet around the concept of justice. As I see the time, I would just like to sum it up in words that as the climate situation worsens further and the floods and the cyclones return ever so frequently, so the bad news about climate disaster keeps piling up and the realization slowly dawns upon us that we are completely out of time and therefore need to devise new modes, forms of expression to communicate better. Even mode of communication has changed in the contemporary times, and we need to look at the modern modes of consumption to be able to reach out to the greater masses. And one such literary existing model could be a form of serialized novel, and that could make a comeback as Robinson's Mars has come back. So in all this, good writing which moves readers, influences behavior will still matter. And in reading, writing, acting upon, and engaging with these texts, we will not only remember about those that are taken away by us through climate disaster or displaced, diseased, or suffering, but we join hands together within the great community of the living who dream and work for a better and sustainable world. Bitus Sehgal, an environmental activist from India, feels that narratives, there is a difference between narratives and facts. But he feels that facts cannot be understood unless and until they are put in the form of narrative. So he talks about, and he also feels that narratives normalizes facts, and it says a subtle change, one that affects you or your neighbor's dog, affects the readers more. This is just about how narrative can be very influencing to the psyche of the mankind. James Holland Jones, a biological anthropologist and an environmental scientist, says that it is a mistake to think that facts speak for themselves. Facts are always incorporated into narratives, and further, in a world where, I'll quote, where politicians and others frequently peddle fiction, the fiction author can tell truths that people otherwise would not hear. So, a better future for the earth is possible if we take action now. Thank you. Yes, Manjari?
I think there is some network issue on the side. Uh, so if there is any question, please unmute yourself and ask, or you can also post in the chat box. And meanwhile, ma'am, I'm reading some of the comments here. Chat box is full. Ma'am, interesting session. Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an informative talk on climate change and crisis. Along with eco-historicism, recently a term called eco-terrorism or bioterrorism associated with the anti-system violence has become a popular topic. Please enlighten me about this in terms of sustainable development or environmental welfare. Mahua asks.
You want me to take that question? Not only these two terms, Mahua, but obviously with the time constraint, because as I said, that climate change is coupled with so many concepts and this new terminology which is coming into being, which is so very contemporary, is all, as a matter of fact, leading to a understanding of how, because there is a change in the very structure of the existing mankind and their mindset, and that in turn, because obviously this will lead further. If I look at it from climate change point of view, it is leading further to kind of, we are looking at oneness, where this is a very strong divide, and this divide creates a separation and further influences the environment, which in itself is facing a violence, and then a violence which is man-made again. So obviously what happens is that these terms which have come, of course, they require a lot of reading. As I said, I am just a beginner like you and a novice. We are all struggling to be able to interpret it in terms of literature, but we definitely need to take it into our, within our reach, to be able to understand not why they exist, but as I said, let us look forward to a remedial action to undo these concepts which are coming into being and are harming not only the psyche but also the planet in so many other ways. So I was not really able to take up all, as I said. It was just a kind of a surface, what you call surfing, or going through something rapidly, and probably also because it requires such a deep study, and it is so very recent that it is not possible to take it up all in a stride in a talk, which has only, I have only taken up certain existing theories and the other theories to be coupled with it. But yes, this terminology, we could have, I just added historicism because I thought that could be a drop in the ocean, and we could continue with this further.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I just would like to take up a couple of compliments for you because the chat box, as you can see, it's full. It was a very useful, informative, and insightful lecture, ma'am. It is a delight listening to you every time. Thank you for taking up such an interesting topic, sharing your valuable insights with us. Um, Thank you, ma'am. It is an urgent need to discuss about climate change in social theories. Such a great talk. So thank you
See,
so much, ma'am.
Rachna being a part of the department knows very well how I would not be looking at the chat box. And
Yes, ma'am.
this is how, the habits and psyche prevail even in the very modern times, So thank you, Rachna. And, my observation is this, that I think we all need to read and reread because it's a topic that should be made very vibrant among students of literature. And it requires a serious thinking. And as I said, that writing or performing or putting it in any other form of will definitely impact the mind, will impact the mind of, in general. And I'm sure that all of us are in smaller ways looking at it as to how we can help the climate get better, because it's not about our existence. It is now the existence of our future generation that we should look for. What is it that we are leaving behind for them? And it has to move beyond theory into practicality. That is how I look at climate change.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely right. We need to take up this idea, this discourse with all urgency. Thank you so much, ma'am. There is an alumna representative who would like to offer a formal vote of thanks to you. So, ma'am, please allow her.
Okay.
Ruchi?
Good morning to Banana present here. It's an honor to give this vote of thanks for Alka ma'am, and thank you so much, ma'am, for this lecture because it is quite important that we need such things, as you rightly mentioned, that we are completely out of time when it comes to drastic change in climate, because we need to devise solution to control future hazards. And you also focused how climate theory has triadic relations with scientific, popular, as well as political concern. And you also talked about how it doesn't stand in isolation, and we need to study social theory as well as climate theory simultaneously. And there was one line which actually got stuck with me, that vulnerability and adaptation goes hand by hand. And you also highlighted how recent fiction such as Ponently Overstory by Richard Tars has ponently portrayed environment concerns, which reminded me of another novel by Barbara Kingsolver. It is named as Flight Behavior. It came to my mind, which also talked about monarch butterflies and how they are displacing their winter habitat from Mexico to Tennessee, which showcases global climate problem. So thank you so much, ma'am, for focusing on such an important topic, which transcends beyond eco-criticism, and you went to eco-historicism. So thank you so much, ma'am, for enlightening on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruchi. And if I can leave you with two words here, one is contemplation and speculation. I'm sure the mission of the faculty development program will be fulfilled. So thank you so much for being patient with me. And it may be sound or not sound, but definitely it will lead to contemplation. I'm sure about that. Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Ruchi.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, Simi ma'am is yet to join. She'll be joining in within, I think, 15 to 17 minutes. And Manjari ma'am is also connected with us now. So, by the time, I would request our senior participants who are faculty members to please introduce themselves so that we can also interact with each other. Um, Shall I invite someone, or if you can come forward and introduce yourself? Chitra ma'am, are you there?
Hello.
Hello, ma'am.
Hello, I'm there.
Yes, ma'am. Would you like to say something? I mean, just introduce yourself and your feedback about the sessions, because only three sessions are left, and we are, or towards the end of the faculty development program. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, sure. It's my privilege and pleasure to be part of this FDP program. I'm Dr. S. Chitra. I serve in Royal University of Bhutan. And as discussed by Madam today, with reference to climate change, Bhutan is a green nation. I'm happy to share these details with you. And it is carbon neutral, carbon negative also. In many ways, it is exemplary for the world to initiate green world for a betterment of mankind and their future. With those words, I would like to share, I have 2 decades of experience in teaching, and I'm with Royal University of Bhutan teaching Masters in English program for in-service teachers. Teachers serving in schools enroll themselves in this program to upgrade their qualification and also their intellectual capacity. It is a capacity building program that we offer for them, in addition to other students who have completed their bachelor's degree in English literature. And that's the background from where I hail and where I serve. Regarding this program, I'm benefiting a lot. And this program happened to be an intellectual enrichment for everyone who have enrolled themselves in this program. And thank you for organizing us on varied topics, the wide range of topics that you have brought in, and the galaxy of scholars that you have brought to deliberate on these topics. The range in
Ma'am, you are not audible.
yeah, that has been taken care of now in this program. And not only that, we have moved on to the contemporary expansion of English studies in this program by talking about disability studies, eco-criticism, and climate studies today. So this range of topics that you have chosen for this program is very impressive, and it's benefiting us a lot. That's my personal impression, and I think most of the participants would have the same. And my request is, if the team could share the videos, the link of this program at the end, that would benefit us more to listen and re-listen to the deliberation in order to contemplate, speculate, and it can provoke our interest to further address these concerns and also to know these fields more in depth.
Sure, Chitra ma'am. Definitely, we'll be sharing all the links, because our institution is having a YouTube channel where all the lectures are uploaded. So we will share the links so that later on also, if you would like to have a glimpse of it, or you would like to revise some of the sessions, you can definitely go for it. And thank you so much for the wonderful comments that you have made. Now, I would like to invite Raj Nanduri sir, if he is there, to say something and introduce himself. Raj sir?
Didi, I think he's not there right now.
Okay, so Aarti Singh Thakur, if I go with the alphabet, alphabetically I'm inviting Aarti Singh ma'am. Are you there? Please come forward and introduce yourself. We have 10 minutes to interact and know each other in a better way so that we stay connected, the department and the participants. Stay connected later also, and we can engage ourselves in some other productive and meaningful activities. Okay, let's go for the next one. Achal? Achal, please come forward, say something.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon to one and all present here. I am Achal from Vasanta College for Women. I am a PG student, and I have enjoyed these sessions a lot. I came across many new things like gender studies and talking about art and trauma. I am a person who connects myself from art and paintings, and these sessions have enlightened me on a broader scale. I can't thank I can't thank everyone enough for this. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Achal. We have Animesh Roy with us. Animesh, please come forward.
Hello everyone. I am Animesh Roy, research scholar at IIT BHU. So this is a wonderful session organized by Vasanta College. I'd like to thank everyone who have organized this wonderful session, and the choice of the topic and the interdisciplinary sections are really interesting. And today's session, I would like to thank ma'am also, because I am a research scholar and I am working on climate issues. So I gathered many knowledge from ma'am, and this will help in my research also. And thank you everyone, just for this wonderful session.
Thank you so much, Animesh. Yes, I would request everyone to please share their research area as well, so that we get to know your work as well. Annie, please come forward. Annie Singh.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Ma'am, am I
Annie.
audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Annie Singh, and I'm a student of Vasanta College for Women, and I'm pursuing my master's right now. So, about this session, initially I was actually not very aware because I do not have a few ideas regard research and all, but this session helped me out in a large surface, and the topics that are continuously being discussed or elaborated in the sessions are quite new for me, and it seems so interesting. The topics we have already discovered, and the topics we are going to learn in the forthcoming sessions. So I'm very thankful, and especially to you, Rachna ma'am, for since you are the one who because of you I came to be a part of this. So I'm much thankful to you and to all the professors. So this was my insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annie. Now I invite Dr. Gurpreet Kaur to say something, to share her research area. Gurpreet ma'am, please come forward. Okay. Dr. Pooja Gupta, please come forward. I request the participants to please come forward, interact, and don't be so passive. Dr. Pooja Gupta. Dr. N. Usha. Indrani Borkar. Are you there? Okay. Jayankar Sharma. Jayan sir, are you there?
Hello,
Let me
ma'am.
move. Hello, who is this? Okay, Vidya Murli. Yes.
Hello everyone. I am Dr. Vidya Merlin Verghese from Kerala. I work at as the assistant professor at Basilis College, Kottayam, which is actually somewhere towards the middle of Kerala, not the exact middle. I am actually working over here, and I am grateful to all of you for this online session. Actually, our classes had begun. Our working hours from 9:30 to 3:30, and I don't know if it is God's grace or my luck to say that anyway, this week we happen to have online sessions. So that way I was able to balance both my offline, the regular classes and the FDP session till date. And I'm grateful to the organizers. I didn't wait for all the others to present their remarks upon about the session as such, because my name is V, and I thought by the time my name will be called, the next session will begin. So I'll just make it fast. And
Thank you so much.
I am glad that I could participate in this. I did my research on Dan Brown. It's actually a mingling of culture studies and structuralism. I focused on his first three texts, and that is my research area, culture studies as such, and Dan Brown. And this FDP session has been helpful because I got to know a lot about many new arenas, like how Dr. Chitra had mentioned about climate change, especially Alka Singh ma'am's session was really enlightening, because I had done a paper on Amitav Ghosh, and I was wondering where can we get extra materials related to eco-criticism, environmentalism, and I thank you, Anka ma'am, for having shared or given us such an insightful message and a wonderful talk. So far, the sessions have been good, and by God's grace, I was able to participate in everything. Thank you for the well-organized sessions, and thank you for having included me too in this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vidya. Your research area is very interesting. And I remember your message. I'm happy that you will be able to join the sessions as well as maintain your, work also. So thank you so much. Who would like to come forward next? Anyone can, like Vidya ma'am, she spoke.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Parvati. Okay.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. Please go.
I'm Parvati. I'm a research scholar at Assumption College, which is in Kottayam, Kerala. I have participated in the one of the FTPs the Vasanta College organized earlier. And the first FTP the college organized was very interesting one, since then afterwards I was looking forward to attending other works and FTPs and webinars for you guys. So especially today's this FTP, a few lectures were very helpful, especially the trauma and the gender and performance. Yesterday's Rachana ma'am's presentations, that was a really wonderful presentation. And today's session also, Alka ma'am's this presentation, that was a really informative session. And my research areas is related to the Anjal system, which is the postal system. And I'm a research scholar in history, not a literature student, basically. So some lectures are a bit difficult for me to understand, but I'm really looking forward to listen to your other lectures, and it's really been a great time for me listening to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to request Annie. Annie, what is your take or feedback on these sessions that you are attending in this FDP? You are not audible, Annie. I think there is some network issue at her end. No problem. May I request Dr. Gurpreet Kaur, if you are there by the time the resource person joins?
Simi ma'am has joined. Simi ma'am has
Okay,
just
okay.
joined.
Okay, so Dr. Kaur, we will be asking your feedback maybe later.
Good afternoon,
Rashna, I
ma'am.
am
Yes, ma'am.
Rashna, I am here. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, Simi ma'am. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, ma'am. Manjri ma'am, Simi ma'am has joined, so we can start.
Yes, Rashna, just a minute. Yes. Good afternoon, one and all. Good afternoon, Simi ma'am. It's a pleasure to invite you on this virtual platform where we are organizing 7-day international online faculty development program. So I welcome you on behalf of Department of English, Vasanta College for Women, Rajghat. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Simi ma'am is currently professor of English at Jamia Millia Islamia University. And when I was going through her bio note, it is prolific, very large. Ma'am has continuously devoted herself to academics. I can see ma'am is head Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia Central University. And ma'am has a specialization in contemporary literary and cultural theory, including post-theoretical development. And ma'am has several recognition awards and fellowships. The list is very long actually, and ma'am has visited many countries for academic purpose. And ma'am has been guiding research scholars since she has come into this academic world in 1999, as I can see. And so and ma'am has also guided MPhil, and ma'am has many projects and publications. The list is very long actually, articles and books. So immense contribution to academics, and we can see that you are continuously connected to teaching and learning. That is the utmost job of a teacher. So with these few words, ma'am, I humbly request you to start the talk, please, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Alka ji. Thank you so much. And I'm really
I am
grateful.
actually Manjari Jhunjhunwala.
I see.
I am using Alka ma'am's mobile because there is no network in my mobile. So
Oh,
I am the senior person I'm senior faculty of this department, Manjari Jhunjhunwala.
right, right. Thank you so
All
much,
right.
Ji. And thank you also to Rachna who reached out to me, and it's my pleasure to be here. So I'll be sharing my screen. So if you'll allow, I'll just present my screen so that.
Sure, ma'am.
You can let me know if you're able to see my screen.
Yes, ma'am,
Yes,
it is
ma'am.
visible.
Right, all right. All right. So, very good morning to everybody, and I'm sure you've had very interesting sessions. And when I was asked to speak, I was thinking what I should speak on, and I thought that at least in the Indian academic context, post-colonialism is something which everybody engages with in one way or the other. And so I thought that I would speak from the position of post-colonialism, but also probably have something else and something new to say. And so I thought that I would take recourse to someone who's well known in the field of post-colonialism, that is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. But instead of concentrating on, his more well-known novels, which I'm sure everybody who's present here would be familiar with, or, Ngugi the playwright, with whom also we are very, very familiar. Instead of that, and something that probably many people may not be familiar with, which is that Ngugi is also a children's writer, and he's written several children's books, though, and that also has to be cast probably within the post-colonial idiom. I thought that I would talk about Ngugi the academic or Ngugi the theoretician. And I thought that Ngugi the theoretician is also fairly well known, since we do engage with his ideas of decolonizing the mind. And so I thought that if I must introduce, so some new terms or some neologisms that he offers in his works, I thought that I would speak about these three categories, which I find very interesting. So I thought that I'll present on poor theory, global ethics, and cyberality, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and post-colonial discourse. So I thought that I would present on some neologisms that he offers. As far as these neologisms are concerned, so I've changed my screen. I hope you can see the change screen. Can you see?
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
All right. So I thought that in order to make my presentation this afternoon, I would talk about not his well-known works like Decolonizing the Mind or his novels or or his plays, but instead I would talk about his 2012 book, which is Global Ethics Theory and the Politics of Knowing. This book is basically a compilation of the lectures that he was invited to give at the Welleck Library Lectures in Critical Theory in 2010. And so basically this is a compilation of the lectures that he had delivered at the Welleck Library. And subsequently, a couple of years later, after some revisions, the lectures were published by Columbia University Press in 2012. And it's a book that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in what I'm going to be talking about. It's an interesting work, and it's a different work in terms of how we encounter Ngugi. So this particular work is Global Ethics Theory and the Politics of Knowing. Before I start, I thought that I should also say a few things about Ngugi, that oftentimes, I mean, since we, in our academic discourse, we approach Ngugi from the kind of reading formation that we have in how he's placed within post-colonial or decolonial discourses. And in that, Ngugi is often thought to belong to the pole of abrogation and not appropriation. So unlike many others who would talk about the empire rights back, he would be someone who would not only give up his Christian name, James, and instead take on his native name, or even give up writing in English and instead take on writing in his native language. We are not wrong in thinking that therefore he would belong to the pole of abrogation when we talk about the post-colonial discourse. However, and in that, of course, we are right, because this is our reading formation. However, as you will see in the presentation that I'm going to make, Ngugi has not only moved away from his his avowed position of abrogation to a completely different kind of a position, where he instead talks about world literature. He talks about almost invoking Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak's idea of planetarity, talks about, of course, multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. These are completely different kind of introduction of different discourses in his works from what we've received or thought Ngugi to be all about. And so therefore I thought that not only is it innovative in terms of what Ngugi himself is doing in terms of his own thinking and how that thinking itself has moved, but also in terms of what he has to say about um, things like poor theory or global ethics or cyberality, also connects to how we therefore must, within our own post-colonial moorings here in India, in the practices that we follow, how we can also start to think with and through Gugi's own writings in terms of how we should look at some of these things. So one after the other, what I'm going to do in my presentation is to talk about these three categories, which you can see on your screen. One is the idea of poor theory. The second is the idea of global ethics. And the third is the idea of cyberality. I need not really emphasize much about theory, because I'm sure this particular course itself has been about theory in some senses. But since I too have my own interest, and I'm sure all of you are interested in theory. But I mean, when we talk about literary theory with a capital L and a capital T, and the received tradition of literary theory, which emerges from certain, epistemic quarters. They travel in a certain way to us, and we receive them in a certain way, and then we deploy them in our own context in certain ways. There has been a certain kind of West-North dominated thinking about theory, though of course within post-colonial idiom one can probably try to think that there has been an insertion of a lever which has tried to somewhat democratize this particular field. And so therefore we have all kinds of people, from Dipesh Chakravarti to Spivak to Homi Bhabha to Gugiwa Thiongo and others, who have been trying to diversify the field of theory. However, there is still a certain kind of a disenchantment with the received tradition of literary theory with a capital L and a capital T. And that has, of course, resulted in fracturing of the discourse of theory, so much so that not only, for now a fairly long time, one has been talking about post-theory or after theory or the end of theory, or at least in terms of diversifying the field by talking about theory from the global south, etc., etc. So there has been a certain kind of a disenchantment with the project of received tradition of literary theory with a capital L and a capital T. In that same tradition, we have Gugiwa Thiongo, who also posits his own category of what he calls poor theory. So let me first begin by talking about poor theory. I'm going to change my slide. I hope you can see. Can you see the next slide?
Yes, ma'am, it's moving. Next slide is there.
Sure. So this is, of course, so I'm not really using the slideshow. I'm just letting the whole slide be there in front of you, since I'll be reading a bit and talking a bit. So this is so it's very interesting. So the introduction to the book on global ethics is titled "Riches of Poor Theory." And he has a fairly strident critique to offer of the received tradition of literary theory. See, if you look at the first quote of what he says, poor theory may also provide an antidote to the tendency of theory becoming like a kite that, having lost its moorings, remains floating in space with no possibility of returning to earth, or an even more needed critique of the tendency in the writing of theory to substitute density of words for that of thought, a kind of modern scholasticism. Some presentations of theory have become like a gift carefully wrapped in layers of beautifully colored paper that the recipient, with great expectation, spends hours opening, only to find a nondescript item inside. Poor theory may simply remind us that density of words is not the same thing as complexity of thought, that such density sometimes can obscure clarity of thought. Now, as you can very well see from this particular quote that I've taken from the introduction, which is titled Riches of Poor Theory, in this book of his called Global Ethics, he, of course, not only offers a strident critique of the received tradition of literary theory, which, of course, as he points out, is often coded or wrapped up in such dense words that it actually does not necessarily amount to density of thought. And so he makes a distinction between what he calls density of words and density of thought. And oftentimes we've seen not only do our students but also teachers struggle with a lot of jargon and a lot of technical vocabulary, which is part of how literary theory or the discourse of literary theory somehow gets written. And so therefore he's of course offering a critique of this tradition of receiving theory, which often is very dense in words but may not necessarily be dense in thought. And so therefore he's obviously offering a critique of this received tradition of theory, and instead what he's talking about is that oftentimes density of words actually obscures thought, and he's instead talking about poor theory, that instead of this whole grand tradition of theory that we receive, which is fairly verbose, which is jargonized, which is fairly ornamental, as opposed to this idea of theory, he is making a case for a more bare, a more elemental, a more clear, which gives clarity of thought, a more elemental idea of theory, which he calls poor theory. So his idea of poor theory is against the received tradition of literary theory, which he sees as much more ornamental and not necessarily dense in thought. And so for him, poor theory offers clarity of thought, and is also something which is able to deal with the complexity of thought. And so for him, poor theory is something which stands against or opposed to the tradition of received tradition of literary theory. He further qualifies this idea of poor theory by talking about the category of poor. So if you look at the second quote on the page, he says, even in social life, poor means being extremely creative and experimental in order to survive. The homeless try to make a home anywhere, even in places that do not suggest a home. A person without the wherewithal to buy clothes will pick pieces of cloth of whatever color, size, and shape and bring them together. He's clearly not worried about matching colors to please the eyes of an imagined critic at a cocktail party. Necessity drives him to yoke into one, a functional one, the different colors, shapes, and sizes. Apart from talking about the fact that poor theory is against the received tradition of a certain ornamental, verbose idea of theory, he's also talking about poor theory, which is much more bare and elemental, according to him, and must stand, therefore, in contradistinction from this received tradition of theory. He also equates the idea of, and so he's of course invoking the idea of poor theory from the category poor. Now, obviously, poor is not a very popular category when it comes to contemporary theory, and certainly we've seen that class is also no longer a very popular category. I mean, ever since a lot of discourse within literary theory has moved towards identity politics, identity markers, whatever those identity markers may be, whether they be caste or sexual preference or whatever, becomes much more current and acquires much more currency as compared to older categories like, let's say, for example, poor or class. However, we know very well that class is a very important fulcrum on which a lot of hinges, as also poor. And I think, if nothing else, all of us who have witnessed, let's say, for example, and these days, these terms have become more current, which is migrant and refugees, etc., etc. But we've seen we've seen, at least in the COVID pandemic, a number of poor people walking away from urban centers to their villages or to their towns, and we've seen that something which often a certain idea of our own preoccupation with middle class media and our middle class preoccupation does not allow us to see that there is certainly a category of the poor. There's certainly a category of the underclass which cannot simply be elided away, and that of course came to haunt us through the various images that we saw of people walking for 600-800 miles to be able to get back to their own homes at the time of the beginning of the lockdown or the pandemic. And so therefore, even though poor and class is not really a popular category anymore, because there are more fashionable categories which have acquired a certain kind of a currency and a certain kind of a value, but we cannot not look at the category of class and poor. And so of course it's very interesting that Googie, and he's fairly well up on theory, he could have invoked any other term, but the fact that he invokes the term poor is actually very instructive, and is very instructive in some ways of telling us about his own ways of thinking. So he of course goes on to say, so he doesn't just talk about poor as something which is only to be seen in contradistinction to the received tradition of a certain grand and verbose theory, but he also enjoins the term poor with certain qualities and certain values. So this is not so he's almost trying to achieve a transvaluation of values of things which have otherwise got devalued. Like poor is not a valued word anymore, but he of course goes on to say through this transvaluation of values that he's almost doing Nietzsche-like by saying that as far as the poor are concerned, the poor are very, very creative and experimental. And they have to be creative and experimental not because they're creative and experimental, but it's a survival strategy for them. So they have to be experimental in order to survive. They have to be creative in order to survive, because as far as the homeless people are concerned, they have to experiment and create homes in places where their homes do not really exist, or they have to create homes where there's no possibility of actually having a home. And so therefore, unlike those who are taken in by the dazzle of color, size, shape, and clothing, and ornamentation, and verbosity, etc., etc. As far as a poor person is concerned, a poor person is someone who is because of necessity, perhaps because of functional needs, perhaps is driven by necessity to be creative and experimental. So that's the second feature of poor theory that he goes on to go on to outline in this particular work of his, which is that poor theory is not just in contradistinction to received tradition of a certain verbose grand theory, but poor theory is also by definition, by nature, by being forced, by almost being driven by necessity, by sheer act of survival, has to be creative and experimental. So that's the second feature of poor theory that Googie goes on to define. The third feature, and that to my mind is actually the most important feature, is the third quote that you can see on your page, where he says, some of the poor actually carry theory on their bodies. Now, this is, of course, a very, very interesting idea. So not only, of course, I'm sure all of you would have talked about in the course itself that, we often talk about now, the world of objects, new materialism, and things like that. So, of course, there is a certain kind of there's a certain kind of in the critique that is offered of the Anthropocene, a certain idea of post-humanism, which would, of course, find life in objects or the world of objects, or in materialism or new materialism in some senses. But what Googie, of course, is offering here is, as opposed to a certain abstract idea of theory, he's talking about theory as something which is corporealized, something which is of the order of the body, something which is worn almost as a marker on the body in some senses. So theory for him, or poor theory for him, is much more corporeal in nature. It is much more experiential in nature. It is much more bodily in nature. It is something which is worn as a mark on the body itself. And so therefore, it's not something which is to be found in some disembodied, airy-fairy world of ideas, or in some sort of an abstraction, or in some sort of a world of ideas and world of mind or thought, but instead the fact that he actually goes on to posit or almost locates the category of poor theory onto the body itself, onto the corporeal world itself, is also a move that Googie is making about how he wants to locate poor theory. So, of course, he goes on to say that instead of looking for theory elsewhere, one needs to look at the theory on the body of the poor, that the poor actually carry theories on their bodies. So it's not to be located outside the corporeal, outside the bodily, or outside the poor. And so, of course, he's asking, almost asking us, his readers, to think of this particular category of poor theory as not just something which is of the order of the bodily or of the order of the corporeal, but it has to be finally located on the body of the poor, because they carry the marks of theory on their body, and so body becomes the teller almost of theory, or the bearer of theory, if one may want to call it that. And this, to my mind, is again a very important move that he's making, not only from the kind of received tradition of history of ideas, or history of thought, or history of philosophy, or history of theory, but instead talking about and of course history comes from the same word as histoire, or story, the French word, but the story of the theory has to be finally mapped onto the body of the poor itself. And this again is the third feature that I would like to highlight of what he goes on to, or how he goes on to imagine his category of poor theory. So I'm going to suspend my discussion of poor theory because, I mean, it's not really the most important category for him or even in my presentation or what I want to talk about. But at the same point of time, one wants to alert oneself of rethinking theory as opposed to the received tradition of theory, which can be creative and experimental, and which can also look at sources of theory on categories or in categories which have otherwise become unfashionable, like the poor. And certainly to make it much more rooted in the corporeal and the bodily in that sense. So I'll suspend my discussion of poor theory here, and instead I will move on to the more important, and that's really the central idea of the lectures that he gave at the Welleck Library, and also the book, and that's why the book is also titled Globalistic. But right in the introduction, of course, he goes on to introduce the category of globalistic itself, and I'm going to spend most of my time in my presentation on talking about global ethics. So if you look at the last quote, which is of course taken from the introduction of the book itself, he says, global ethics is derived from the shape of the globe. On its surface, there is no one center. Any point is equally a center. As for the internal center of the globe, all points on the surface are equidistant to it, like the spokes of a bicycle wheel that meet at the hub. Globalectics combines the global and the dialectical to describe a mutually affecting dialogue or multilogue in the phenomena of nature and nurture in a global space that's rapidly transcending that of the artificially bounded as nation and region. Globalectics embraces wholeness, interconnectedness, equality of potentiality of parts, tension, and motion. It is a way of thinking and relating to the world, particularly in the era of globalism and globalization. Now, as you can make out from a googie that we have received through the novels that we have read, through the plays that we have read, or through even the theoretical engagements with his own writings of decolonizing the mind, and the kind of kind of position he would take in terms of taking on his native name, writing in his native language, almost giving up writing in English, and therefore becoming much more rooted in the category of the local or the regional or the national, as opposed to this googie that we have known and received through the readings that we've done. If you look at this idea that googie now seems to be talking about, not only is it a response, of course, to a certain idea of the era of globalism and globalization, but look at the move that he's making in terms of how he's revising his own position vis-a-vis the category of the nation, or the category of the region in some senses, by of course positing the idea of globalectics. But his idea of globalectics is of course not to be confused with the idea of globalism and globalization. Globalectics is a response to globalization, and if within the post-colonial idiom one has to think about how does one negotiate this field of globalization, then globalectics is Googie's answer. Now, and of course, as you can make out, that globalectics is embracing the idea of the globe. I mean, pretty much like, let's say, for example, when Spivak would talk about the death of the discipline, and she would invoke the category of planetarity, which is, of course, even going beyond the idea of the globe in some senses. And of course, thereafter, many people like Dipesh Chakrabarty and others have written extensively about it. But Googie, of course, from the kind of position that he belongs to, is, of course, in his encounter with globalism and globalization, positing the idea of globalectics, which of course, as he says, is invoking the idea of the globe in some senses, but his vision of the globe is not the same as how, let's say, finance capital globalization or corporate globalization, or even a certain political economic idea of globalization would imagine. His theoretical point of view about what he imagines globalectics to be. And in a while, I will also talk about globalectics not just as an ontology for him, but also as an epistemology and as a method in some senses. But he, of course, goes on to imagine globalectics as a globe, which is part of his imagination of what he says, that when you encounter a globe, there is no one center. Every part is equidistant from the center. And so therefore, this is almost a restructuring or a reimagination of the globe in some senses, which is not just thought in terms of binaries like the east or west or north or south, but talking about a more democratizing impulse behind imagining the globe as a place where all parts of the globe, be it the global south or be it the global north, is equidistant from the idea of the center. And of course, all parts are therefore equidistant, and so this idea of global of his idea of globalectics in some senses is of course a reimagination of how therefore we need to rethink and restructure and reimagine our own locations within this globe or within this discourse of globalization itself. But as you can make out, that globalectics is, of course, is a term which is a portmanteau term, which is a combination of the term globe and dialectics. And so globalectics is the term that he invokes, where he goes on to say that it combines the tendency of the global and the dialectical, where there's a mutual dialogue between what we might consider the globe and what one might consider oneself. And so in one's own relation with the globe, there's a dialectical relationship which is mutually affecting. So it's not just simply an affect which is produced by the global north on the global south, but the global south also impinges on the global north in some senses. And so, of course, what he goes on to say is to move away even from the idea of dialectics and a dialogue to the idea of a multilogue. So if one has to talk about in the era of globalization, multinationalism or multiculturalism, etc., then one has to necessarily talk about a multi-log where it's not just any longer a dialogue, but a multi-log or a multilectics, if one wants to invoke one's own neologism here, where this multi-log is not just between the different partners in this global idiom, but in this phenomena, and that's why I talked about planetarity in a little while back, where he also brings in the idea of nature and nurture in a global space. So it's not just simply a question of humans, but also non-human others, and also the idea of climate, the idea of nature and nurture in some senses, which the globe has to embrace. So it's not just a dialogue between geopolitical locations, but also our location within the globe and within the planet, if one may want to invoke that, where one is also talking about, therefore, the idea of nature and nurture in a global space, where, of course, what he goes on to say, that we have transcended, and this is very significant and important in terms of, let's say, the shift in Gugi's own thinking, where one has transcended artificially bounded nation and region. You see, so look at something which was a fulcrum of his thought for a fairly long time, where in response to the colonial encounter, he would take recourse to the idea of the decolonial nation or the post-colonial nation, or decolonizing through the category of the nation, and the nation became the fulcrum. But now he does not shy away from actually calling the nation and region an artificially constructed or artificially bounded region in that sense. So, of course, in response to globalization, through his category of globalectics, which is, of course, a democratic, a diversified idea of a multi-log between different partners within the globe, which is also aware of this nature-nurture consciousness in some senses, he invokes the idea of globalectics, which embraces, therefore, according to him, a certain idea of the globe in its wholeness, and not just in its partitiveness, but in its wholeness, and also in this interconnectedness which he invokes, where all partners are equally or equidistant, as he said a little while back about equidistant from the center. And of course, therefore, there is a certain kind of an equality which has to be engineered here in terms of the potentiality that all parts have within the globe. And of course, there are tensions and motions within that itself. And so therefore, this becomes for Gugi a way of thinking and relating to the world, especially in the times of globalization. And this, to my mind, is a very, very instructive move within Gugi's own oeuvre, but also in terms of post-colonial discourse, of how post-colonial discourse in response to globalization, of course, needs to think through categories of not just post-colonialism and decolonization, but through neologisms that Gugi offers us in terms of globalectics. And so globalectics becomes a way of thinking and relating to the world for Gugi. I'm changing this slide. You can tell me if you can see this.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So since globalactics is really the heart of his thinking of how he imagines postcolonialism to be rethought in some senses, and he'd already introduced the idea of globalactics in the introduction, but the chapter which actually devotes, and the lecture actually devotes maximum attention to the idea of globalactics is chapter 3 in this book, which is titled Globalactical Imagination: The World in the Post-Colonial. And so, as I've already talked about it, which is that post-colonial, in being responsive to the era of globalization, at least in Gugi's own world, offers us this category of globalactics, which is not just an ontology but also an epistemology. And so, therefore, in this chapter, he engages with the idea of globalactical imagination. Now, what is, of course, very interesting is what Gugi does, which is that he moves away from the idea of national literature to talk about world literature. And which, of course, would come as a surprise to many who have encountered Gugi only from a certain standpoint or from a certain point of view. But he does talk about world literature. And since one is talking about globalization, one is talking about globalactics, and one is talking about world literature in some senses, and how do we look at the world in the post-colonial is what his concern is. He, of course, offers us a certain idea of a globalactical imagination, which I'll speak about in a little while. But as one can imagine, that when he posits the idea of world literature, it is, of course, against, in some ways, the idea of national literature or the idea of regional literature. And so world literature, of course, is in distinction to what his own thinking or practices of writing would have been. And of course, it's not therefore a surprise that he would take recourse to those who have talked about world literature, people like Marx and Engels and people like Goethe in his work. So he, of course, quotes Goethe, and Goethe, of course, was the one to talk about Welsh literature, where he talks about, so he quotes Goethe, and I'll just read the quote where he says that national literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. Now, of course, this is something that Goethe had said at a certain historical point of time in 19th century. But by the time we come to 21st century, and Gugi, when invoking Goethe, when he's talking about that national literature is no longer a meaningful term, that the world literature is at hand, and of course one must strive to hasten its approach. It's with a certain kind of an urgency and immediacy that he speaks, because obviously Goethe was still writing in the 19th century, but Gugi is writing in the 21st century, where one is necessarily hemmed in by the discourses of globalization, and when one encounters world literature willy-nilly in any case. And so therefore, in invoking Goethe or talking about world literature, there's a specific context which is much more immediate and urgent for Gugi than it was for Goethe. Similarly, he goes on to quote Marx and Engels, and if you look at the second quote, he says the intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness becomes more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. Obviously, Marx and Engels, again, were writing in the 19th century, but for Gugi, the context of 21st century globalization or the era of globalization, which makes him therefore turn towards globalactics, makes him talk about world literature in a hastened tone, where, of course, he quotes Marx and Engels, who talk about that the intellectual creations of individual nations have become common property. We don't think of Gugi as a national writer only. He's a global writer, and Gugi gets read, whether it's in Australia or Asia or Europe or America. So, of course, he is part of that pantheon of what we may consider world literature. And so therefore, one cannot talk about national boundedness anymore, or national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness. Now, it's very interesting that he's invoking the nation as something which is one-sided and narrow-minded or parochial, if one were to use one's own term. And of course, he says that it is, while Marx and Engels in 19th century were talking about that how it's become an impossible category, national, but in 21st century it has become an even more impossible category in that sense, because of the world order or world literature itself, which is of course a product of globalization in some senses. And so therefore, even though there might be local literatures, regional literatures, national literatures, but they all combine together to constitute what one may call, especially in this time of globalization, the category of world literature. And so he quite rightly would invoke, when talking about world literature, people like Goethe and Marx and Engels. And if you look at how he therefore brings in the idea of the post-colonial close to the idea of world literature, unlike Spivak, who would talk about the death of the discipline, comparative literature, world literature, etc., etc., if you look at how he invokes the idea of the post-colonial within the same breath as world literature, if you look at the third quote, he says, at present, the post-colonial is the closest to the Goethean and Marxian conception of world literature, because it is a product of different streams and influences from different points of the globe, a diversity of sources which it reflects in turn. The post-colonial is inherently outward-looking, inherently international in its very constitution, in terms of themes, language, and the intellectual formation of the writers. It would be quite productive to look at world literature, though not exclusively, through post-coloniality. Now, this is, of course, moving away from what Goethe and Marx and Engels were talking about. Gugi, of course, talks about approaching the whole category of world literature through post-coloniality. For him, it is post-colonial, or the post-colonial idiom, or the post-colonial rubric, which is actually the one which is closest to the idea of world literature, which actually makes for world literature in some senses. And so therefore, this is again a very important move that Gugi is making, not just in his thought, but also in his writing, by suggesting that post-colonial is the way of embracing or of even approaching the category of world literature. And so, of course, he says that because ultimately the post-colonial is the one which actually represents diversity, represents multi-nationalism, multiculturalism, which brings in different streams and influences from different parts of the globe, and actually creates for diversity, which must be a constitutive feature of world literature. And so, therefore, if world literature has to reflect this diversity of sources, then it has to necessarily be post-colonial. And that is what his argument here is. And so he, of course, goes on to say that unlike, let's say, for example, his earlier position, where post-colonial would be seen as inherently inward-looking, he's talking about post-colonial as something which is inherently outward-looking. It is inherently not national or regional or local, but is inherently international. And so, of course, this is a significant way in which he's also reconstituting his own understanding of post-colonial, which is outward-looking and international in its constitution itself, in the intellectual formation of the writers itself. And so, of course, he almost calls upon us to look at world literature through the lens of post-coloniality, or one needs to approximate world literature through the category of post-coloniality itself. And so, of course, what he goes on to say, and this, according to me, the next quote is, according to me, a very, very important quote. He says that in reality, the post-colonial is not simply located in the third world. Literally rooted in the intertextuality of products from all corners of the globe, its universalist tendency is inherent in its very relationship to historical colonialism and its globe for a theatre. The post-colonial is at the heart of the constitution of Goethe's world literature, and even in theory, it indeed constitutes the non-imperial heart of the modern and postmodern. Now, this is very, very significant and important. Unlike those within theory who do talk about global south, or talk about, locating theory, or talking about theory from the global south, his argument is that post-colonial is actually a lever, not just to talk about the third world, or to talk about, what were the erstwhile colonized countries or nations in that sense, but post-colonial, but the whole world is a post-colony, according to him. It's not something which is to be located only in the third world or only in the global south. If you look at the intertextuality which has come about because of the colonial encounter experience, it has affected all corners of the globe. And whether you look at the erstwhile form of colonialism, which is historical colonialism, or the current form of colonization, which is globalization in some senses, there is no part of the globe which is untouched in some senses. So post-colonial is not to be located only in the global south or in the third world is the category, of course, that he uses. The whole world is a post-colony. So post-colony is to be located as much in the global north, as much in the erstwhile colonizer nations, colonizer countries, as in the global, as in the current global dominant countries, as it has been located in the third world or in the erstwhile colonized nation or in the global south in some senses. Now, this is of course a very, very important point that he's trying to make, that that the world is a post-colony. That no part of the world is actually unaffected by the colonial, and colonial is not just something which happens in terms of its experience and in terms of in terms of what happens to the erstwhile colonized countries or the current colonized nations in some senses. It also affects the colonial master. It also affects the erstwhile colonial powers, so to say, or the current colonial powers. And so therefore, post-colony is not just simply to be located in the third world or in the global south, but it is to be found in all parts of the globe. So for him, post-colonial is not just a way of looking at world literature, but post-colony, the whole world as a post-colony, is to be located in all parts of the globe, equidistant from the center, as he invoked when he talked about globalectics. And so, of course, he goes on to say and this lens is, of course, important for him to not just talk about globalectics or to talk about world literature or to talk about how post-colonialism must be the lens through which we look at world literature today, but for him, if one has to talk about a non-imperialist tendency, a diversified, democratic impulse of post-colonialism, then that has to be located in the modern and the postmodern through the idea of the post-colonial. And the post-colonial is that particular non-imperial heart of the modern and the postmodern. So therefore, for him, the post-colonial is the one which actually brings about it has at its impulse the idea of anti-imperialism, whether it was in response to a historical colonialism or to current forms of globalization. If one has to talk about the non-imperial heart of the modern and the postmodern world, then one has to do it through the lens of post-colonialism, because post-colonialism is the lens which actually allows for diversity of sources, as he argued a little while back, as also reimagining the globe or to think about a multi-log in this globalectical imagination has to therefore make us imagine the globe as a post-colony, the whole globe as a post-colony, and not simply to be located only in certain parts of the world. Erstwhile colonial and current colonial powers are as much affected by this in this multi-log, in this globalectical imagination, as were the erstwhile colonized nations. So this is, of course, a very significant argument that he goes on to make. Moving on, can you see the next slide?
Yes, ma'am. It's chapter 3.
Right. Chapter 3, Globalectical Imagination, the World in the Post-Colonial Continued. So, of course, what he now, of course, having talked about his ideas, and since we are all teachers and we're interested in pedagogical practices, he has certain things to say about that as well. So, if you look at the first quote where he says, in such a world of shared intellectual property, organizing the teaching of literature on the principle of national boundaries is outmoded. And even more so, the export of national literatures as a superior knowledge. Goethe advised fellow Germans to look beyond the narrow circle that surrounds us. He liked to look about himself in foreign nations, and he advised everyone to do the same. Goethe and Marx did not see or mean that any one national literature would constitute world literature. World literature would be like the sea or the ocean into which all streams from all corners of the globe would flow. So, of course, what he's trying to tell us is that we need to reorganize our teaching of literature itself, and it need not be based on the principle of national boundaries, because that has become an outmoded mode in some senses, and something which probably was held up as a principle in its early response to colonization, in the post-colonial moves and the decolonizing moves which were made, which is that our national literature has our superior knowledge as compared to other national literatures. This, of course, is a regressive, a certain kind of a parochial, insular way of looking at the category of not just one's own literature, but also at the whole category of world literature. World literature has to embrace all national literatures and all what might be considered foreign literatures as equal and not necessarily inferior or superior in that hierarchy, which is generated in some senses. And so world literature has to therefore invite almost in an equidistant kind of a way in which he was talking about the globalectical imagination from all corners of the globe. And of course, what he goes on to say is so we need to reorganize our teaching of literature in some senses with this principle in mind. And of course, he's aware of the fact that our pedagogical practices might actually find this quite overwhelming. So if you look at the second quote, he says, the result is the vastness of the sea and the ocean. Confronted with the possibility of that reality, and quite frankly, its vastness, it is easy for organizers of literary knowledge to stop in fright and stay within a national boundary, taking comfort in the certainty of the structures already tried and passed on as tradition. The traditional organization of literature along national boundaries is like bathing in a river instead of sailing in the ocean, or trying to contain a river's flow within a specific territory. So, of course, what he's trying to say is that in any discipline, and especially for those who organize literary knowledge, or those of us who are engaged in the or in organizing the teaching of literature itself, one can always take recourse and fall back into what might be considered comforting, and so therefore one might take comfort in certain certainty of structures which we have embraced, and which we have learned, and which we have passed on and taught, and which we quite lovingly call as tradition. But this tradition, which makes us therefore embrace the idea of national literatures, is not the response that Googie asks us to really think about, but instead, if one has to look at globalization and the era of globalization, and one has to embrace the idea of world literature, then one has to cross these boundaries, national boundaries, parochial boundaries, and these insularities in which we, almost create our own silos and our own straight-jacketed structures of knowledge, literary knowledge, and one has to step outside this comfort zone, and one has to embrace the other in all its alterity, in all its foreignness, if one were to use that term. And so therefore, and so this is the plea that he's making to us, the teachers, or us, the ones who organize the teaching of literature. And if one has to embrace this idea of globalectical imagination, which has to rethink and restructure and reimagine the field of literary scholarship itself, he's asking us to do this. And of course, he goes on to say, and this is his plea, he says, works of imagination are amazingly antinational. And this is very important, even where the author may think she or he is espousing national themes. People identify with a good tale and characters irrespective of the tale's region of origins. Like a mirror or a camera, a work of art may reveal more than consciously intended. Works of imagination refuse to be bound within national geographies. They leap out of nationalist prisons and find welcoming fans outside the geographic walls. But they can also encounter others who want to put them back within the walls as if they were criminals on the loose. Equally important, if not more so, are approaches to the text, how we read it. Do we want to welcome it, or do we want to put it back into prison, or even a new prison? So, of course, he's asking us, the ones who are engaged in the teaching of literature, that howsoever nationally bound or nationally produced or nationally based an author might be, as far as works of imagination are concerned, they are anti-national in their very impulse, because they have the capacity and the tendency to take us beyond the here and now, into another world, into another place. And so therefore, this is the nature of literature itself. So even when a writer is talking about national themes, or is speaking from an absolutely regional or an absolutely local or an absolutely national frontier or position, so to say, it has the ability and the capacity and the tendency to be able to actually transcend these national boundaries, and so therefore in its very impulse becomes anti-national, becomes transnational, or goes beyond the category of the nation or the boundedness of the nation, and so therefore it is able to travel beyond its geography, and is able to go beyond its nationalist prison, if one may call it that. And of course, he says that there would be within disciplines always tendencies where there would be those who would want to actually embrace the idea of loosening the literatures from its national boundedness, and there would be those within the teaching of literature who would want to put them back into prison, and probably even create new prisons, and so new parochialisms, new identity politics, new kind of regionalities, new kind of nationalities, etc., etc. So there would be those tendencies which would like to talk about boundaries and boundedness and territorialities, etc., etc., and there would be those who would be much more deterritorial and would talk about actually transcending borders and boundaries. And so therefore these both tendencies exist within the practices of teaching literature. And so, of course, he says, but the question is, of course, a political question, an ethical question, a moral question. And he says, the question arises, do we want to free and be freed by the text? It depends on how we read it and what baggage we bring to it. to release the worldliness in all its multifaceted character, it's perhaps better to read literature, any literature, through a globalectic vision. So, of course, for him, globalectics, like I said, is not just an ontology, it is also an epistemology, it is also an imagination, it's also a method, it is also a vision in some senses. So, of course, he says that ultimately, what is it that we hope to be able to gain from the experience of teaching literature? Do we want to be freed by the text? Do we want to be free and freed by the text? Or do we want to be bounded by the text? And of course, he says that it entirely depends on our own reading of the text in some senses, what baggage we bring to it. Do we want to actually let loose the worldliness of the text and all its multifaceted character? Or do we want to actually tie it down and bring it back into a prison cell, so to say? And so he says, and of course, he's letting his position be known, which is that we must read literature, any literature, not just national literature, regional literature, local literature, but what might be considered an approach to world literature which is much more cosmopolitan, if not cosmopolitical, through what he calls a globalectic vision. That our vision must be globalectic, which must be able to embrace the idea of globalectics, which, of course, as you have seen in the discussion that we've had, is, of course, embracing the idea of the world or the globe as a post-colony. And, of course, the imagination of the globe itself is something which imagines all parts as equidistant from the center. I move on to my second last slide, where so of course he's continuing with this chapter where he's talking about globalectical imagination, the world in the post-colonial. I hope you can see the slide, the change of the slide.
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
Right. So, of course, he's talking about certain, so he's having talked about globalectical imagination, not just as an ontology, but also as an epistemology. He's talking about certain things, also certain things which might actually pose an obstacle to this globalectical imagination or to this globalectical vision or this globalectical lens or method of reading text. And he talks about two obstacles, and I'll talk about that quickly one after the other. He says, one of the obstacles to a globalectic reading is the tendency to look at literature and the languages of its birth in terms of hierarchy. The notion that some languages and cultures are inherently of a higher order than others. This is the current relationship between languages. What elsewhere I've called linguistic feudalism, with an aristocracy of languages at the top and menial barbaric languages at the bottom. In this hierarchical view, a few European languages, principally English, French, Russian, German, Italian, and Spanish, are the aristocracy, and those from Asia, Africa, Latin America, indigenous America, and the rest are ranged in the descending order of power and prestige. Literature and culture tend to be valued according to what position the language of composition occupies in the hierarchy. I've argued for a collapsing of this hierarchy so as to view the relationship between languages and cultures and literatures in terms of a network, akin but not identical to Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome. In a network, there is no one center. All are points balanced and related to one another by the principle of giving and receiving. The pedagogical organization of literature should reflect that sense of a common heritage of simultaneously taking and giving assumed by a network. Central to the pedagogical enterprise is the practice of translation. Translation is the language of languages. It opens the gates of national and linguistic prisons. It is thus one of the most important allies of world literature and global consciousness. Now, of course, this is the first obstacle that he's talking about, and we're all aware of this obstacle, which is the idea of linguistic feudalism, where in a certain hierarchy, there are certain languages which are considered more powerful as compared to the others. But of course, as he talks about the fact that just as he's talking about organization of the teaching of literature, teaching of literature through a globalectical imagination, he's talking about here rethinking the relationship between languages, where he's talking about collapsing the hierarchy, this linguistic feudalism which has created this hierarchy, to view the relationship between different languages, literatures, and cultures akin to what Deleuze and Guattari have talked about in terms of an assembly, a rhizome, a network, and of course he says that because in a network, unlike, let's say, for example, a vertical organization, a horizontal organization, there is no one center and all points are related in a network or in an assembly, so to say, where there is a mutual giving and receiving. So this pedagogical reorganization of literature that he's talking about, of doing away with this idea of linguistic feudalism or this linguistic hierarchy, can be brought about by him through what he invokes through the practice of translation. And so therefore he calls translation as a language of languages, because it opens the gates of what he calls national and linguistic prisons. So of course there are literatures and cultures which are tied within linguistic prisons of national languages, etc., etc. So one of the most important allies for him, or the tool through which one can actually rethink and rework this hierarchy of linguistic feudalism which has existed, is through translation. So translation becomes a tool of actually democratizing languages, literatures, and cultures. And so for him, that is an ally of world literature and of this global consciousness and global imagination that he's talking about. He further goes on and he says globalactics becomes the way of reading world literature. And now these are his closing comments about basically globalactics. He says globalactical reading means breaking open the prison house of imagination built by theories and outlooks that would seem to signify the content within is classified, open to only a few. So of course this connects to the first point that one was making about poor theory, where because of a certain kind of a certain kind of a jargonized, verbose, received tradition of theory, because of density of words, the theories actually get confined only to a few. He's talking about opening up the discourse of theory to taking it into the world of poor theory, as we've talked about earlier. And of course, globalactical reading will also allow, therefore, to take literatures, cultures, and languages outside the prison house of imagination of nations and regions, to the world of what he calls the globalactical imagination or globalactical reading. And he says, therefore, this involves declassifying theory in the sense of making it accessible, a tool for clarifying interactive connections and interconnections of social phenomena and their mutual impact in the local and global space. So, of course, accessibility is a very, very important tool of his idea of what he calls not just poor theory, but also what he calls globalactical imagination. He says world literature, of which the postcolonial is an integral part, is our common heritage as much as the air we breathe. So I'll move on to the last point now, and this is my last slide, which is, so I've talked about globalactics at some length, as I had said I would, but now I will go on to the third category that I want to talk about, which is the category of cyberality. I'm assuming that you're able to see the last slide, that chapter 4.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Right. So chapter 4, of course, is titled The Oral Native and the Writing Master, Orature, Orality, and Cyberality. So he's already talked about previously about the idea of linguistic feudalism. Now, while talking about linguistic feudalism, of course, he's offered translation as a way of actually democratizing and diversifying the field of this, vertical hierarchy of languages. As opposed to that, of course, he's talking about cyberality, where we know very well that there is also a certain kind of a hierarchy which exists between oral discourse and written discourses. So oral languages and cultures and written languages and cultures. So, of course, he's talking about another category here, which is the idea of aesthetic feudalism, where we create a certain kind of a hierarchy between how we look at oral literatures and cultures and written literatures and cultures, and how, therefore, we attach value to these literatures and cultures. So if you look at the first quote, he says, aesthetic feudalism, arising from placing cultures in a hierarchy, is best seen in the relationship between oral and written languages, where the oral, even when viewed as being more authentic or closer to the natural, is treated as the bondsman to the writing master. With orality taken as the source for the written and orature as the raw material for literature, both were certainly placed on a lower rung in the ladder of achievement and civilization. Of course, that has changed over a period of time, but we know very well that writing and oral have been in this hierarchical relationship of the writing master and the oral native. And this, of course, is what he calls a certain kind of an aesthetic feudalism, which has made us, therefore, look at oral literatures, cultures, folk performances, whatever, etc., in a certain way, as compared to cultures which are written cultures and writing cultures in a different way. And so there's a certain kind of a hierarchy which has been perpetrated, an aesthetic hierarchy which has been perpetrated by writing and by writing systems and by oral organizations. But he says that this aesthetic feudalism itself is being reworked and rethought in what he goes on to say about what is happening to literature now. He says If you look at the second quote, he said the lines between the written and the orally transmitted are being blurred in the age of the internet and cyberspace. This has been going on for some years with the writing down of the orally transmitted, the electronic transmissions of the written as spoken through the radio and television, or simply the radio as a medium of speech. But it has surely accelerated with all corners of the globe becoming neighborhoods in cyberspace. Through technology, people can speak in real time, face to face. The language of texting and emailing and access to everything, including pictures and music in real time, is producing a phenomena that is neither pure speech nor pure writing. The language of cyberspace may borrow the language of orality, Twitter, chat rooms. We have been talking when they mean we've been texting, or chatting through writing emails, but it is orality mediated by writing. It is neither one nor the other. It's both. It's cyberality. So this is, of course, the third concept that I wanted to talk about, which is whole idea of cyberality and the idea of cybernature. And of course, what he says is that this hierarchy of aesthetic feudalism, which has generated this idea of the writing master and the oral native, is being broken willy-nilly, whether we like it or not, in this age of internet and cyberspace, where what we now practice, whether we chat, or whether we write text, or whether we WhatsApp, or whether we are in Twitter rooms or in chat rooms, or we are posting things, or we are recording our audios, or listening to ebooks, or whatever, etc., etc. The point that he's trying to make here is that in the world of the internet and the cyberspace, and this has been happening more and more now, people from all corners of the globe are becoming part of this neighborhood in cyberspace, where what we practice today is neither speech nor writing, neither pure speech nor pure writing. It is neither this nor that. It is both in some senses, and that is why he calls this cyberality. So it is cyber and orality. So of course it is a visual form, but it is also musical. It is also something which is pictures. It is also visual. It is also words. It's also oral articulation. And so therefore what is getting produced more and more in the world of the internet and the cyberspace is neither one nor the other, but it is both. And this is what he goes on to call cyberality. And so of course he ends this particular chapter, which is his fourth chapter, which talks about cyberality, by asking that will this produce cybernature? That will be produced, therefore, cybernature. Again, I mean, of course, it's a portmanteau term of cyber and orality, and cyber and orality, and so the cybernature. And he says, like literature, he says, already we have entered the world of ebooks and audiobooks on CDs. A host of endless possibilities. All we can say is that writing and orality are realizing anew the natural alliance they've always had in reality, despite attempts to make the alliance invisible or antagonistic. I hope that this means that no cultures or communities need to be denied history because they had not developed a writing system, that the oral and the written are not and have never been real antagonists. Certainly, the powers of their products, orature and literature, will continually be harnessed to enrich creativity in the age of internet and cyberspace. The problem has not been the fact of the oral or the written, but their placement in a hierarchy. Network, not hierarchy, will free the richness of the aesthetic, oral or literary. So of course it's not a rhetorical question that he's asking about, that will we produce cybernature, because cybernature is already being produced. There are already in the cyber world all kinds of ebooks and audiobooks that we hear. So it's not read anymore, but it's heard, so to say. And so of course there are endless possibilities which actually exist in terms of all kinds of ways in which we encounter creative expression in the world of the cyber world or the internet, so to say. And so, of course, he said that it is only in our imagination that we actually imagine an antagonistic relationship between the writing master and the oral native, that we've created this hierarchy between oral and the oral traditions and the written traditions, so to say. And so therefore he says that today in the world of cyberality or the world of cybernature, no cultures or communities need to be thought of as without history if they've not developed a writing system, which was, a certain kind of a way of imagining people. And of course, therefore, a lot of oral cultures had to start inventing writing systems to be able to actually write down their own cultures, which were primarily oral or folk or performative, or in that sense, or to have a written system of actually expressing themselves. So of course, they aren't really antagonists in that sense. And he says both orature and literature can have existed, can exist, and will exist, so to say. And of course, will and currently, at least in the age of the internet and cyberspace, are being harnessed to enrich creativity in some senses. And so for him, it has never been, the oral and the written have never never really been real antagonists in that sense, but it's primarily the hierarchy in which they've been created that has been the problem. So again, as opposed to the idea of linguistic feudalism, where he was talking about network or assembly or rhizome, again he says that what we need to imagine is not a hierarchy of the written and the oral, but instead one needs to talk about a network, an assembly to really encounter and to really engage with the richness of both the oral and the literary. So with that, I will stop, and there's still some more time if we want to have a discussion. So thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for this scholarly session, I must say. And now I invite participants for their questions. Now this is question answer session, ma'am. So I invite participants for the questions. I invite participants. I repeat, am I audible for the questions?
Yes, you are, but there might actually not be any questions.
Yes.
I'm just seeing if there's anything in the chat.
Yes, Dr. Manjesh Shukla.
Right. I can see.
Yes, there is a message by Manjesh Shukla, ma'am.
Yeah, right. So let me just respond to the questions as they come in the chat box. So Manjari, the question is, of course, that can you suggest some books that can be used as beginners reading? So poor theory is not really an established, Manjari, it's not really an established field. It's basically a way of fracturing the discourse of received tradition or literary theory, with a capital L and a capital T. And so poor theory does not really have a oeuvre or a corpus of its own that, there are 10 books on poor theory. It's a position really, So there really is no particular book, but I'm sure, those of the people who get influenced by Gugi's ideas would probably have book titles which would be called poor theory, but there's no particular book that I can recommend as an example of poor theory, because it's really, a way of answering back to the received tradition of theory. Chitra, of course, asked that is multilog also polyphonic in nature as viewed in new literatures in English? Absolutely, and that's exactly the idea of multilog, that it has to be polyphonic, Chitra. So of course, he does not really use Bakhtinian terms of polyphony, but in the ways in which he's talking about multilog, he's obviously talking about a polyphony of all kinds of partners and players who are part of the globe, whose voices must be heard, and not simply of those who've been erstwhile dominant or the current normatively dominant people. And so therefore he's been talking about equidistance from the center, a network, breaking linguistic hierarchy, breaking aesthetic hierarchy, etc. And so he's really making an argument for a certain democratic impulse, which is of course based on the principle of polyphony and hearing all kinds of voices in that sense. So you're absolutely right.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This is just formal vote of thanks. I think there is any question. I'm sorry. Any question?
I can't see any more in the chat box.
All right. Ma'am, here I am to present formal vote of thanks. We are really thankful for this very, very scholarly session, and indeed this poor theory is quite new, and we need to work on it a lot more. So thank you once again from the core of heart, and we look forward to another such session in future, ma'am. So thank you once again. Thank you all the participants, and thank you organizers.
Thank you.
All.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for listening to me. And thank you, Rachna, and of course, the Vasanta College and the department.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Best. Bye-bye.